Welcome back to the War Room, where we're heading off on a bit of a trail through history, looking at interesting battles. And we're starting off with the first siege of Saragossa in 1808 in the Peninsular War. This battle not only highlights some of warfare's constants, but some elements of the siege are surprisingly modern. Saragossa is arguably an early taste of the kind of much later urban fighting in places like Stalingrad and Grozny, not something that fits into the mould of formal siege warfare in the 17 and 1800s. I'm relying mostly on the first volume of Oman's History of the Peninsular War for this. Despite being first published in 1902, this is a very solid, very readable piece of work. I'd really recommend it, and the other 6 volumes that go with it. 1808 is a tumultuous time for Spain. The year before, Spain was one of France's allies, part of the continental system, and had cooperated with Napoleon's plans to invade Portugal. Despite this, the French emperors decided that Spain would be a much more trustworthy ally if his brother Joseph was sat on the throne. So French troops transiting across Spain, supposedly heading to reinforce the French army corps occupying Portugal, instead start taking control of key Spanish cities. Pamplona, Burgos, Valladolid and Madrid find themselves hosting imperial French forces, while more armies cross the Pyrenees, seizing the border fortresses before the Spanish garrisons realise what's going on. The Spanish people are understandably upset about this, seeing the whole affair as a massive national humiliation by a weak and corrupt government. In March, a mob seizes King Charles IV, forces him to first dismiss his much-hated advisor Manuel de Godoy, before forcing him to abdicate in favour of his son Ferdinand. In May, Napoleon invites both father and son to Bayonne in France, pretending to offer a diplomatic solution, but in fact forces Ferdinand to abdicate in favour of Joseph Bonaparte. Meanwhile, in Madrid, a spontaneous popular uprising breaks out, and the French troops in the city swiftly and violently put it down. This throws Spain into chaos. The government has sided with the French, the population revolts, the army begins to disintegrate as units throw their lot in with one side or the other. Central authority breaks down, cities, towns and regions begin setting up their own local governments, mobs root out perceived traitors and execute them. It's a real revolutionary atmosphere. And in the middle of it all, there are 100,000 French troops. Marshal Murat, Napoleon's man in Madrid, reports back with an optimistic, pretty sanitized view of the situation, implying that nothing worse than localized rioting is going on. Based on this, Napoleon dispatches his orders. The bulk of his armies are to be held in reserve around Madrid, the lines of communication back to France are to be maintained, and smaller forces are to be sent out to restore order. One of these forces, 4,000 men under General Lefebvre Desnouettes, is dispatched to secure the middle Ebro Valley and the city of Saragossa. Saragossa at the time had a population of about 60,000. It had originally been a Roman city founded in 25 BC and expanded organically over the centuries into a warren of narrow streets lined with stone buildings. The city itself lies on relatively flat ground straddling the river Ebro, with the smaller river Weber running across its south and southeastern edges before joining the much larger Ebro. On the other side of the river to the north is the suburb of San Lazaro, which is connected to the city centre by a bridge. From a defensive standpoint, Saragossa does not have modern fortifications. It has a medieval outer wall, but this is so hopelessly out of date it won't provide any protection against modern artillery. Outside the city to the west there is the old Moorish castle, the Aljaferia. There are also a few convents scattered about in front of the walls, as well as plenty of olive groves and orchards. To the south, on the other side of the river Weber, is Monte Torero, a hill providing an excellent position for any attacking force to set up their siege batteries and dominate the south side of the city. So the natural and man-made defences of Saragossa don't have an awful lot to recommend them. The state of the garrison is even worse. Part of the King's Dragoons Regiment is stationed in the city, in the cavalry barracks up against the southwestern wall, but this is only 300 men strong, and they have 90 horses between them. There are another 450 men of an Aragonese volunteer battalion, 200 assorted gunners and sappers, and 500 regular soldiers who have deserted from their units and accumulated in the city. Into this mix comes Joseph Palafox. Palafox is 28 years old. He was formerly a member of the King's bodyguard, but this is mostly a ceremonial position, there's no military experience attached. He's basically a courtier. He's confirmed as Captain General on the 26th of May, and immediately goes to work with boundless energy to improve the defences of Saragossa. By the 8th of June, he's raised 7 regiments of levies from the city and surrounding countryside, a total of 7,400 men. These are raw and poorly trained, but they are somewhat bolstered by the few regulars present and all of the retired or half-pay officers that can be rounded up. Palafox builds a powder factory, there's plenty of artillery in the city but not a lot of ammunition, and requisitions as many horses as he can to actually mount his cavalry and provide draft animals for the guns. But he's not content to wait for Lefebvre to arrive. He sends out a force of 2,000 men under his brother to try and stop or delay the French advance down the Ebro. They meet at Tudela on the 8th of June where, despite being backed up by another 3,000 to 4,000 locals, the Spanish force is quickly routed. The French sack the town and carry on, defeating the Spanish again when they make a stand at Malon. After this, Palafox himself comes out to reinforce his brother, bringing the Spanish force up to 6,000 men, backed up by 150 dragoons and 4 guns, and occupying a defensive position near Alagon. Again, the French, who despite being outnumbered are superior in cavalry, artillery, training and experience, smash Palafox's army with ease. The Captain General himself is wounded and his horse shot out from under him as he leads a cavalry charge. After the battle, he leads his force back into Saragossa with the French not far behind. Palafox is understandably shaken. He's lost 3 battles in a row to the seemingly unstoppable French, he's sustained personal injury, and so he changes tack. He decides that it's a terrible idea to try and stand up to the French directly. Instead, he gathers his remaining cavalry and a corps of regulars and leads them out of the city to the north over the Ebro. His plan is to go out into the countryside, raise more levies, and use them to attack the French lines of communication as they besiege Saragossa, hopefully forcing them to raise the siege and withdraw. On June the 15th, as Palafox is leaving, the French arrive. Lefebvre immediately decides to take Saragossa by storm. Up until this point, the Spanish haven't presented any serious resistance, the city's defences are clearly antiquated and dilapidated, one short, sharp shock, and surely the Spanish will collapse. With any luck, they'll come out and surrender the city before there's any significant fighting. And this is entirely in line with the military conventions of the time. City and fortress garrisons were not really expected to fight to the bitter end. Once a breach had been made in the walls, or the attackers had secured a foothold, and it was clear that resistance would only delay the inevitable at the cost of significant suffering for all parties, then the defenders were expected to surrender, and the attacker would generally allow them to march out under their colours with their honour intact. So Lefebvre divides his force up, sending his French brigade to attack the Portillo and Carmen gates in the west and southwest respectively, and ordering his Polish regiment to attack the Santa Engracia gate in the south. At Santa Engracia, the Spanish have built an earthwork battery for some guns at the gate. The Polish lancers charge in and overrun this before plunging off into the city. Riding through the narrow streets, they find the buildings on either side infested with defenders who constantly pepper them with musket fire. The Polish infantry, meanwhile, has been forced to stop back at the gate under a deluge of fire from the adjacent convent of Santa Engracia. The lead battalion gives way and falls back from the gate, the remainder of the regiment taking up positions in the relative safety of the olive groves outside the walls. The lancers, meanwhile, finding themselves unsupported and taking increasing casualties, are first stopped and then turn and try and cut their way out back through the streets to the gate, almost being destroyed in the process. At the Portillo gate, the French scale the walls, but they're unable to force the gate itself, and the toehold they do establish is cleared out by a charge of defenders from the nearby cavalry barracks. Believing that the Spanish will lose the will to fight in the face of sustained pressure, Lefebvre orders the assault renewed. This time, his men are able to take the Portillo Gate and the cavalry barracks, the Carmen Gate and the Santa Angrecia Gate, but trying to grind their way into the city itself, they find themselves confronted with barricaded streets and buildings prepared for defence. Everywhere they try to push, they're met by hails of musket fire from loopholes and windows, and they rapidly become bogged down, having to try and clear every house with the bayonet. The Spanish, meanwhile, are able to regroup, massing forces behind the Bull Ring in the west and around the Santa Angrecia convent in the south, before counterattacking and sweeping the French out of the city. All in all, the French lost 700 men, including several guns that had been dragged up to the Portillo Gate but were unable to be recovered due to fire from the Aljaferia. According to Oman, the Spanish have lost 300. A major component of defence has been the citizens of the city. This wasn't a defence conducted entirely by Palafox's hastily raised levies. Saragossa has gone all in. So it's a little unclear as to whether those 300 casualties include both the garrison and the citizenry, but at the same time, most of the defenders spent the battle behind cover, so a lower casualty figure would make sense. Luckily for the Spanish, news of Palafox's departure hadn't had time to spread through the city before the assault. Things could have gone very differently if the defenders had known their captain general was leaving through the back door as the French assaulted the front. As it is though, Palafox sends his brother back to take command, and now much more confident that the city is actually defensible, continues with his plan to threaten the French communications. Lefebvre, meanwhile, pulls back from the walls. Taking the city by storm obviously hasn't worked, so he sends out requests for more men and more guns, especially siege artillery. Some of this, including 2 more Polish battalions from the 2nd Regiment of the Vistula under Colonel Klopiski, have already arrived by the time that Lefebvre becomes aware of Palafox trying to manoeuvre on him. By the 23rd of June, Palafox has accumulated a force of perhaps 4,000 men at Epila, clearly in position to advance up the valley of the Zeeland and cut the French off. Lefebvre knows that this will put him in a dangerous position, but he only has about 6,000 men. If he splits his force to cover Saragossa and go after Palafox, each component will be small enough to risk being destroyed, thus forcing the other to withdraw or face the same fate. But if he goes after Palafox with his entire army, he will have to raise the siege, allowing the defenders the time and space to improve their position without the certainty that he will actually be able to engage Palafox in battle. It's not inconceivable that the Captain General could simply refuse to engage, at which point the French are basically just wandering around Aragon. So Lefebvre takes the risk of splitting his force. He detaches Colonel Klopiski with the 1st Regiment of the Vistula, a French battalion, a squadron of lancers and 4 guns, and orders him to Epila to destroy Palafox, keeping the defenders in Saragossa busy in the meantime by conducting noisy demonstrations with his remaining force. Klopiski falls on Palafox's army at Epila on the night of the 23rd of June and decisively routs it. He sacks the town and then returns, job done. Palafox is able to escape and makes the entirely sensible decision to avoid open warfare with the French from here on out. He takes the core of his force, about 1,000 men, back to Saragossa via circuitous route in order to personally take command of the defence. The defenders, meanwhile, not too bothered by the French outside the walls, have been busy improving their positions as much as they can, stockading the gates, backing the walls up with earth to increase their thickness and increase their protection from artillery fire, building more barricades in the streets, and fortifying more of the buildings. Outside the walls, the French are getting more reinforcements all the time. General Verdier arrives on the 26th of June, replacing Lefebvre by dint of seniority, and brings with him another 5 battalions, or 3,000 to 3,500 more men. In addition, before the end of June, more battalions arrive, 2 Polish, 1 French, and, somewhat bizarrely, 2 Portuguese, plus 1,000 French National Guards who have been dispatched across the border from Bayonne, and 3 more squadrons of cavalry. All in all, the strength of the French force rises from about 6,000 men to close to 15. More importantly, a siege train arrives. This consists of 30 siege guns, 4 mortars and 12 howitzers, mostly from the Spanish arsenal at Pamplona. The main difference between this kind of artillery and the field pieces that the French have had up to this point is their size. They are much bigger. A typical large field piece might be a 12-pounder, while a typical siege gun might be a 24-pounder or larger. They're much more difficult to move about. They're not battlefield pieces. They're designed to be dug in and used against static targets. The first thing that Verdier does is seize the Monte Torero. This is a key piece of terrain, a prime position for the French siege guns. The Spanish understand this, but their position on the hill is poorly fortified with some incomplete trenches, and only lightly defended by 500 men. Worse for the Spanish, there's a fire in the city the night before Verdier's planned attack. According to Oman, a careless worker managed to start a fire in Saragossa's seminary, where the main powder magazine was located. This blew up, spreading the fire to the surrounding buildings, and all through the night and the morning, the garrison is far too busy fighting the fires to help out the men defending Monte Torero. As a result, when Verdier throws 3 battalion columns at the position, the defenders break and flee. The colonel in command is later court-martialed and executed. With the Monte Torero cleared, the French start setting up their siege batteries both on the high ground and in the west. They're ready to go by the 30th of June, and the bombardment starts at midnight, the siege guns battering the walls, while the mortars and howitzers lob shells into the city behind them. The damage is significant. Saragossa's defences were simply never designed to resist this kind of punishment. The Aljaferia, the Portillo Gate, the Convent of the Augustinians, and the Misericordia are all badly knocked about in the west, as well as the Carmen Gate in the south. The garrison tough out the bombardment, trying to refortify breaches in the wall as they're made, and building barricades in the streets behind them to make them more difficult for the French to exploit. The civilian population takes cover in cellars, basements, and the more strongly built structures in the city, like the churches. After watching Saragossa's fortifications crumble away after only a day's battering, Verdier launches an assault on the morning of July the 2nd. This storming force is more than twice the size of Lefebvre's first attack, made up of 10,000 men in 6 columns. But despite the damage done by the bombardment and the increased mass of the attack, it gets nowhere. The French are unable to gain any permanent lodgements in the city. Even the isolated Spanish positions beyond the walls, the Aljaferia and the convents, remain in the defenders' hands. The convent of San Jose, actually on the other side of the Huebra in the southeast, is taken by the French, but after a few hours the Spanish are able to throw them out again. This isn't to say that the assault was doomed to failure. The fighting is hard, and the French come close to penetrating the city. Things are hardest at the Portillo Gate. At one point, the French have shot down all the gunners manning the battery defending the position, and are on the verge of success when a woman named Agustina Zaragoza runs out to one of the guns, grabs the lit match from the body of her dead lover who was manning it, and discharges a 24-pounder loaded with canister into the advancing French column at point-blank range. The shock is enough to stall the attackers, giving the now encouraged defenders the chance to countercharge and drive them back. It's a bit of a legend, which was undoubtedly milked for the propaganda effect, but it illustrates the fierceness of the fighting and just how close the French came to overrunning some of the Spanish positions. Oman records that the French lost 200 dead and 300 wounded, with the Spanish suffering fewer losses as a result of fighting under cover. Verdier now commits to a formal siege. This is a very different undertaking than attempting an escalade. It's going to take a lot longer and use up a lot more resources. On the 3rd of July, the French begin work on their first parallels. Parallels are lines of trenches or gabions following the line of the enemy fortification, allowing the besiegers to move across the front in relative safety, creating an obstacle to slow down the defenders if they make a sally, and provide a secure line from which more trenches can be dug forward, bringing the besiegers closer so they can build more parallels to place batteries closer to the walls where they will be more effective, and get storming parties closer to the breaches under cover where they have less danger area to cross in an assault. At the same time, Verdier throws a force across the Ebro to try and cut the city off. As long as the Spanish can bring supplies and reinforcements in from the north, through the suburb of San Lazaro and across the bridge, then they're going to be able to sustain their ability to resist. However, despite having been reinforced, the French still don't really have the manpower to maintain a significant force across the river, so the detachment on the far bank is limited to stopping small Spanish convoys and harassing larger ones. It's better than nothing, but it's not able to completely isolate the defenders. By July the 15th, the parallels have advanced close to the walls, and the next 10 days see limited French attacks that clear up the outlying defensive positions in the south. The convents of San Jose, Capuchins, and Trinitarians are all stormed and incorporated into the parallels. Not long after, Verdier's preparations for a third assault are complete. A new bombardment opens at dawn on the 4th of August. It only takes 5 hours for the French siege train to neutralise the exposed Spanish batteries and reduce much of the southern wall to ruins. The wall is simply incapable of resisting the battering, and the French open plenty of breaches, especially around the convent of San Engracia. Again, the garrison attempts to repair these and further fortify positions behind the new breaches, but it's an uphill struggle. Eventually, the French knock down a 300-yard stretch of wall. There's just nothing the defenders can do to plug a hole like that. Confident in the effects of his artillery, Verdier orders the assault in at 2 in the afternoon. 4 Polish and 9 French battalions advanced from the parallels in 3 columns, aiming at the eastern side of the convent of San Engracia, the gate of San Engracia, and the Carmen Gate. In this assault, the French have 2 major advantages they didn't have before. Firstly, the artillery has comprehensively demolished the outer layer of defences. Secondly, Verdier is concentrating his attack in a small area instead of spreading it out across the length of the walls. In only a few hours, the French successfully establish a foothold in the south. The Spanish hold on for a while in the cloisters and church of Santa Engracia, but are ultimately forced out, leaving the attackers in possession of 1,000 yards of the outer wall and its adjoining buildings. In formal siege protocol, this generally means that the game is up, and the defenders are obliged to surrender. Verdier sends a one-word message out to Palafox. Capitulation? Palafox sends back the message, war to the knife. So the French attack continues, pushing north through the warren of buildings. This is hard going. The streets are barricaded, the buildings are fortified, loopholed, and full of angry, armed citizens. To quote Oman, the French could only get forward by storming each house and turning each barricade that offered resistance. Casualties are heavy on both sides. The French are getting shot down in the streets and the alleyways as they try to advance and force their way into the buildings. The Spanish are less at risk of being shot, but in the close quarters fighting that results when the French storm individual buildings with the bayonet, there is no quarter. Late in the afternoon, victory and defeat are hanging in the balance for both sides. The French have reached the Calo del Coso, the main street cutting across half the city, but they're starting to get bogged down. Units are fragmented, the soldiers are exhausted, some of them are breaking away to start looting, traditionally the reward of soldiers who storm a settlement. The Spanish, meanwhile, are also starting to fray at the edges. Some men are trying to pull back over the Ebro via the bridge. They're only stopped and forced back once artillery is placed at the far end to discourage them. Verdier sees his chance to push the Spanish over the edge and personally leads a push from the Coso towards the bridge. The French make some progress, but Verdier is wounded in the fighting and they quickly lose momentum again. Worse, by now the Spanish are sure that the other sections of war are not going to be attacked. They're able to pull elements of the garrison away from the unthreatened sectors and mass them for a counterattack. This goes in at dusk, and the Spanish begin overwhelming the French with sheer numbers, forcing them back in vicious house-to-house fighting until the French penetration has been reduced to a thin wedge with its point on the Coso and its base at the wall. By the end of the day, the French finally have a foothold in Saragossa, but they've got it at the cost of about 2,000 casualties, 462 killed and 1,505 wounded according to Oman. The Spanish have also suffered heavily, though numbers are unclear. They certainly haven't spent the whole time fighting from the safety of cover like they had been in previous assaults. There's been plenty of high casualty, close quarters combat. Overnight, both sides work to fortify their positions. Occupied buildings are loopholed and mouseholed, streets and doorways are barricaded, guns are dragged up to dominate any stretches of open ground. In the morning, desultory fighting breaks out, but neither side is pushing. They're content for now to take potshots at each other. Palafox meanwhile, was not in the city for the assault on the 4th. He'd ridden out to coordinate with an incoming supply convoy. This was bringing 2 regular Spanish battalions, a few thousand levies, and hundreds of wagons of much-needed ammunition. On the 5th, he skirmishes with the French troops north of the river, forcing them back and fixing them to allow one of the battalions and some of the wagons into the city. He intends to pass the rest of the convoy through on the next day, but holds off to see how the French react as he receives some important news. Back on the 19th of June, down in southern Spain, a French army under General Dupont had fought a battle against Spanish regular forces near the village of Bailén and lost. This is the first defeat of a Napoleonic French army in the field, and it's not a minor affair. Dupont surrenders with 17,000 men. It's a huge shock for the French in Spain and a huge confidence boost for the Spanish. Very obviously now facing significant organised resistance rather than the scattered uprisings and riots that Murat had led Napoleon to believe, the French start pulling in their outflung exposed detachments and seek to improve their positions in the north until the Emperor himself can arrive with overwhelming force. Verdier, exposed and entangled at Saragossa, is ordered to be ready to withdraw whilst fixing the Spanish forces in the city in place. He's accumulated large stockpiles of ammunition for the siege and, realising that he's not going to be able to take it all with him, he orders the bombardment resumed. On the 8th, with the French clearly not ready to leave just yet, Palafox brings the convoy into the city. Verdier realises that his force on the north bank is not going to be able to achieve anything, so he pulls them back across, removing any threat to the Spanish lines of communication. On the 13th, the Spanish start to see signs of a drawdown in the French siege camps. On the 14th, Verdier begins demolishing his siege works, the batteries and the parallels, while evacuating the French toehold in the city proper. It's not practical to retrieve all of the guns from the siege works and the streets. The French spike, throw into the river or otherwise sabotage a total of 54 before they leave. By August the 17th, Verdier's force has totally disengaged and reached Tudela, on its way back towards the safety of the French main force in the north. In total, throughout the siege, the French have taken more than 3,500 casualties. The Spanish have likely taken more. Oman suggests that of Palafox's original 7,000 strong force, only 3,500 are left. Factoring in casualties amongst the civilian defenders, he believes that total Spanish losses of 4,500 would not be surprising. That's the first siege of Saragossa then. What makes this interesting from a military history perspective? The siege didn't fit into the expectations of the time. Saragossa was not considered defensible, its fortifications were several hundred years out of date, and there were only a handful of regular troops in the garrison. According to established norms, the way things were done, the defenders should have surrendered the city, either when the French arrived, or, if honour or the strategic situation dictated resistance, after the breaches had been made. But the garrison didn't. They were prepared to fight to the bitter end, and they weren't alone. The population of Saragossa was prepared to fight with them. In fact, if the garrison had attempted to capitulate, they would probably have all gotten lynched. The weakness and corruption of the Spanish government, humiliatingly exploited by the French in their underhanded invasion and combined with Napoleon's casual, arrogant imposition of his brother as king, provoked an intense wave of Spanish nationalism. This wasn't the environment the French were used to dealing with in the wake of their conquests. Elsewhere in Europe, war was fought between professional soldiers, and the civilians generally stayed out of it or were easily pacified. Not so in Spain. For the Spanish, the war rapidly became a war of national resistance in which the entire population took part. So when the French arrived at Saragossa, they weren't just facing the demoralised remnants of Palafox's levies they had already defeated 3 times in a row, they were facing the motivated, committed Saragossan citizenry as well. Of course, motivation and commitment are useful soft factors, but alone they don't produce effective combatants. Palafox's levies out in the field were also motivated and committed, but they couldn't stand up to overwhelming artillery fire, French infantry columns, or charging Polish lancers. Open warfare at the time rested on the ability of units to maintain discipline, perform drill maneuvers, and coordinate with other arms. Palafox certainly went to fight with infantry, cavalry and artillery, but his force was overwhelmingly an infantry one, and one which was inevitably poorly trained and inexperienced. The French, fighting a combined arms fight utilising all three elements working together, were absolutely dominant outside the city. But inside the walls, in that warren of narrow streets, within the buildings and behind the barricades, the threshold for combat effectiveness was reduced. There was no need for keeping in rank under the stress of incoming fire, no need to do any drill or manoeuvres. All a soldier or volunteer needed to do was stand behind a loophole, window or barricade and fire at the attackers. Even the complexities of loading muskets could be mitigated. The interior of a fortified building is a much safer place than a battlefield. Men and women can specifically serve as loaders and keep the shooters supplied with a steady stream of loaded weapons. It's also harder to run away in an urban environment. The close quarters and potentially limited escape routes result in hard fighting. Troops can be forced to fight to the death at the point of a bayonet in a way that is very rare in open fighting. Out in the field, bayonet charges very rarely actually make contact with the enemy because the charge either collapses or the intended recipients flee. But fighting house to house in this period, with the impracticalities of reloading single-shot muskets or pistols in close quarters, the bayonet is the primary weapon. In other words, the strength of the city of Saragossa didn't lie in its crumbling walls, but in the urban environment itself and the people living in it. It's the streets and the buildings inside the walls that break the French combined arms team. Cavalry is entirely unsuitable. Even the initially successful charge of the Polish lancers in their first assault was ultimately a failure. Artillery is difficult to maneuver and bring up in the streets, and those short ranges make the crews very exposed and vulnerable, not least to the defenders' own artillery, which can remain stationary at barricades and in buildings, undercover and ready to clear streets with close-range canister fire. In a similar vein, the source of the infantry's strength in the open field, its drill, discipline, mass and massed firepower, are more difficult to use to good effect attacking an urban area. It's an exercise in brute force at close quarters, storming doorways and staircases, clearing rooms and corridors. This isn't to say that the French were not better trained or equipped, but that the advantages they gained from those strengths relative to the Spanish were much reduced. It's also worth noting again that this kind of fighting was specifically discouraged by the military norms of the day. The defenders were strongly encouraged to give up before any street fighting actually happened, probably exactly because of the fact that urban warfare was difficult, time-consuming, and resulted in heavy casualties and collateral damage that military professionals sought to avoid, whether they were attacking or defending. So in some senses, the first siege of Saragossa represents a break in continuity. The combination of national resistance and urban warfare was certainly unexpected by the French, and the siege arguably has more in common with modern urban battles such as the Battle of Stalingrad than it does with the experience of sieges in the 1700s and 1800s. There are still some important military constants though. Most critical to the course of the siege were the effects of external events. The siege ultimately ended not because the French in the city had been fought to a standstill or because they were incapable of advancing any further, but because the overall French strategic situation in Spain changed. The Battle of Bailén, the first field defeat of an Imperial French army, necessitated a consolidation of French operations, a temporary switch to the strategic defensive, and that meant that Verdier had to raise the siege, disengage from Saragossa, and retreat to the north. By means of comparison, at the end of 1808, the French come back with 50,000 men and crush the city in another 3-month siege. Beset by overwhelming French strength and an outbreak of plague, and with no deus ex machina to save them this time, Palafox ultimately surrenders the city in February 1809. Another key component in the French difficulties in the first siege was their inability to isolate the city. A vital source of strength for Saragossa was its site straddling the river Ebro. This meant that any besieger would have to split their force and maintain troops on both banks to properly invest the city. This simply wasn't an option for Verdier because he didn't have enough men. Although he was able to put a detachment across, it wasn't strong enough to prevent external support from reaching the city. Supplies, ammunition, reinforcements, and messages could flow into Saragossa and prolong Spanish resistance. Had the French cut off this lifeline, as they did later in the second siege, the defenders would have had a much more difficult job. In a similar vein, the early stages of the siege saw Palafox attempt to halt or delay the French advance by fighting outside the walls, and later to fall on the French lines of communication back up the Ebro Valley and force them to leave. Lefebvre was put into a difficult position with the city to his front and Palafox lurking on his flank, and had to take a serious risk to resolve the situation. So external operations and strategic events can have significant effects. Military operations, like sieges, do not take place in a vacuum. Further down the scale, closer to the tactical level, pieces of key terrain and positions beyond the city walls were of vital importance to both sides. The most obvious of these was the Monte Torero. Once this was taken, the French were able to set up their siege batteries on high ground with much better fields of fire and effect. Monte Torero is exactly the kind of terrain feature whose importance has changed over time. When the city was originally founded and when it was fortified in the Middle Ages, a hill some distance to the south was not a defensive problem. Fast forward a few hundred years and factor in technological developments that have extended the range and increased the power of artillery, and it's a serious problem. In the original defensive scheme for the city, the Monte Torero was a minor irrelevance. By 1808, it had become a chunk of key terrain that, in an updated scheme of defence, would have undoubtedly have been defended by a fortified outwork. The Spanish were naturally aware of this and did maintain a position there, but it was lightly held, poorly fortified, and unable to resist. Also important down at the tactical were the outlying convents and the castle of the Aljaferia, which provided external points of resistance for the defenders. These complicated the French assaults, forcing them to choose between ignoring them, avoiding them, or reducing them. In fact, in the first assault, they marched right past the Aljaferia to attack the Portillo Gate, but when this failed, the French had to abandon some guns they brought up because the fire from the castle prevented them from being extracted. These kinds of outworks are key components of fortification systems. They force the attacker to reduce them before they can get to the real work of attacking the walls. In the case of Saragossa, they were extemporized, but they served a similar function to the redans and hornworks of more formal, up-to-date fortresses by soaking up the attacker's time. And time is always critical. All defensive arrangements, fortresses and cities will fall given enough time and enough pressure. The point of fortified strongpoints is to burn the attacker's time. This is part of why both Lefebvre and later Verdier attempted to quickly take Saragossa by storm. They have other orders, they have the whole province of Aragon to secure. They don't want to become fixed in place conducting siege operations unless they really have to. The more time they're camped outside the city, the more time the Spanish have to generate and organize resistance elsewhere, the more time what Spanish field armies there are have time to develop operations against the besieging force or its lines of communication. Verdier spent 10 days clearing up the convents so that he could push his parallels and breaching batteries forwards. 10 days in which the Battle of Bailén took place and the whole French strategic situation changed, ultimately leading to the raising of the siege. It's not impossible that, without being forced to invest time reducing the Spanish outworks, Verdier could have launched his third assault earlier and prevailed before news of Bailén took effect. So that's the first siege of Saragossa. Like I said at the beginning, a really fascinating, relatively unheard of urban warfare classic, at least outside of Spain. I think it's worth finishing up with Oman's take. Yet, whatever their sufferings, the Saragossans had turned over a new leaf in the history of the art of war. They had defended for 2 months an unfortified place by means of extemporized barricades, retrenchments, and earthworks, and had proved their ability to resist even a formidable train of siege artillery. If the news of Dupont's disaster, that's the Battle of Bailén, had not arrived in time to save them, they would have no doubt succumbed in the end, as must any besieging place which is not sooner or later relieved from the outside. But meanwhile, they accomplished a rare feat. Almost unaided by regular troops, almost destitute of trained artillerymen and engineers, they had held at bay a force which Napoleon at the commencement of the siege would have supposed to be equal to the task of conquering not only Aragon, but the whole eastern side of the Iberian Peninsula. Hope you all enjoyed this one, and I'll catch you in the next video.